Welcome back to Up North at 4, and joining me now is Jim Bokern. He is a historian, also involved with the Hops and History program, which, for the folks at home, Jim, how would you describe Hops and History? Essentially, people get together, they have some drinks, obviously, that's where the hops get involved, but also there's presentations from local historians telling local stories, and that is where you come in. Tell me a little bit about the program itself.
Sure. Bill Vankos invited me to show up this January and talk about moonshining in the Northwoods, and it was well attended and enthusiastically received. And Hops and History is a forum where we can bring forward topics that are somewhat related to Rhinelander, but also all part of the heritage of the Northwoods region. And we just have a lot of fun sharing those stories and creating camaraderie.
Yeah, and you were telling me before off camera too that at these events, it happens almost every single time. The event ends, and then either that day or the next day or whenever it is, someone's reaching out to you saying, hey, I saw during your presentation X, Y, and Z. You know, my grandfather was involved.
Yeah.
What's that been like?
It's been ongoing. And so I would say the Hops and History experience in January was a launch pad into this whole research on moonshining in the Northwoods. I received outreach from a gentleman in Park Falls and said, oh, did you know about the underground tunnels and the underground still in Springstead? I go, no, please tell me about that. And I reached out and talked to some of the folks I know in Springstead, and sure enough, there was a novel moonshining operation there that was under the facade of a maple sugar manufacturing business. Wink. Oh, yeah, yeah. And then it was really quite an elaborate scheme, small in scale. In that particular case, they had a connection in Chicago as through a pharmacy as a pharmaceutical assistant. And people don't really realize that during Prohibition, you could get a prescription for alcohol. But, you know, so the pharmacists, but they want the cheap alcohol. They want, you know, not to pay the feds for prescription alcohol. And so they had this method of getting the alcohol down there through the postal service, because both the postmistress and the assistant postmistress were all part of the family. So they could just mail the maple syrup that had two different labels, and they would just know what was maple syrup and what was moonshine.
Was not.
And I mean, we would have never found that without Hops and History, you know, to bring that story back full circle.
Because you brought it up a little bit. You're talking about Chicago and all that, and you mentioned to me before, you're not as interested in the Al Capone, the John Dillinger piece of history as it relates, but what fascinates me, just as someone from the outside here, like, yeah, I knew about the shootout at Little Bohemia. I knew, you know, Al Capone had hideouts. But it's interesting to start to see that there is that local connection. And as you kind of like look deeper and deeper into this, there are some, I call it, shady characters in the Northwoods.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, plenty of shady characters. And I like to focus on how this affected locals, you know, families just trying to make a living during the period of the Great Depression, certainly the end of the period of Prohibition, but even in the 20s, there was an agri-recession after World War I, and many of these families were hurting, and they needed the income from moonshining. Speaking of John Dillinger, that's a great example. He's the end of the story. You know, that's 1934. And there was a well-worn path to the Northwoods of gangster activity. And we can go back to the very roots of the families in Manitowish Waters, to the Laporte family. And we have a picture that I shared with you of a still in operation. And as Louis Laporte there, local, you know, indicted by a grand jury, you know, twice arrested, you know, before 1924, very active in moonshining. But there he is with Emil Winnetka. This is the guy who starts Little Bohemia, who then ushers in John Dillinger later. So to trace it backwards, and the real cool thing about this is that you see the two of them together and you know the outcome of Little Bohemia and John Dillinger.
Right.
But the connection was that Louis Laporte's sister, Nan, was the rum runner. She was the one who bootlegged the liquor down south to the areas of Racine and Chicago where Winnetka was working. Well, she married Winnetka, and Winnetka moved up here. So you see the grassroots story kind of flourishes into a much more robust story and an interesting one that really helps define our community, not just the Dillinger event, but, you know, those families are still in Manitowish Waters, and we're really proud of our heritage, and it's more than just John Dillinger.
Of course. And I wanted to ask you some more questions about this, because I got a lot.
Okay, I'm ready to go.
Quick break, though, Jim. Stick with us. We'll be right back on Up North at 4. Welcome back to Up North at 4. I'm joined by Jim Bokern, a historian who is involved with hops and history, primarily looking at moonshine as it relates to Northwoods history. And Jim, you were just kind of sharing some stories about these local connections to people in, you know, Mercer, Manitowish Waters, ties to Rhinelander. I mean, it's all over. You can kind of trace the fingerprints back all across the Northwoods here. And the cool thing about this, these families who were involved with moonshine, whether it was distilling it, running it, serving it, whatever, a lot of them are still here.
Right.
And it's kind of crazy to look back, you know, almost 100 years at this point, that we can still find those connections. How cool has that been for you?
Oh, it's been amazing. It's one of the most amazing connections I made after Hops and History was right here in Rhinelander with Kathy Steffens. Matter of fact, right after this event, I'm going to her house to do a YouTube video with her on her father, Joe Seraphin, who was probably the most prolific moonshiner in Rhinelander. He also ran a brothel in town, was a noted gambler, and we can go on from there. And his story is really an exciting one. And this is one of the flourishes that we got from that first Hops and History event. And there are other family stories that pop up all the time.
Wow. And so, Jim, we were talking before, there is a human element to a lot of history as you kind of look in the Northwoods. Obviously, a lot of people want to focus on the good, the railroads, the logging industry, but you call it the human element of history. What do you mean by that when you say that?
Well, I mean, locals in this area during the 1880s forward, it was very much like the Wild West. We were a frontier region, and some of the behaviors were more raucous and more in keeping with the kind of frontier lifestyle that you see heralded in the American West. And you know, there was gunplay and intimidation and drinking and brothels and gambling, and all of those effects spilled out across the Northwoods, just like it did across the American West. And so as it relates to moonshining in this area, you see that, most every large community would have a brothel or two or three, depending on the size of the community. They were making moonshine locally, but they were also distributing it out to urban areas. There were locals who would make connections with different interests, usually from Chicago, but sometimes from the St. Paul gangs. And this led to inter-gang conflicts that spilled out in the Northwoods. We have kidnappings in Manitowish Waters that took place, where groups out of Hurley, which has a notorious history with moonshining and these kind of human activities during a frontier period, they kept coming to Manitowish Waters to hide out, to hide their kidnapping victims, to basically hide illicit contraband and like moonshine and other things that they were involved in. And when you think about it, with the mining communities up in Hurley and the large Italian population, how hard is it for the Italian gangs to come up and stay in a place like Mercer, Manitowish Waters, Winchester, Hurley, and these fast relationships were made, and so. Absolutely, this became a roaring, raucous region for not only lumber and mining, but even in the days of early resorting, people came up here for the more free-spirited experiences.
The free-spirited experiences. I like that term, and I might steal that going forward. And Jim, of course, you have a couple more presentations coming up in October, of course.
Yes.
And so I'm sure people at home would love to stay up to date. So Hops in History, they can follow along and see when your next presentation will be. Of course, they're also on the YouTube page as well. So check it out
for
there.
Manitowish Waters, right.
So check it out there, Jim. It has been so much fun chatting with you. I've learned so much already. We're going to take a break. We'll be back on Up North at 4.